You're on.
Oh. Hey, the Allen special tape doesn't work when you have a silly scruffy beard. So, just grow some on like a tie here. Hello, friends.
Hello.
Good to be with you. Good evening. This is a special time, and I'm going to stay on a microphone because we're recording it for a handful of people, and not because I like to hear the sound of my own voice. So that's what we're doing. Let's pray, and I brought a prayer for us. This prayer is attributed to Sir Francis Drake, 1577. Let's pray. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true, because we have dreamed too little, when we arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas, where storms will show your mastery, where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push into the future in strength, courage, hope, and love. Amen. Amen. I have a captive audience, so I get to share a couple of quick announcements. The first is that we're going to have what we call a Great Day of Joining on Palm Sunday, April 14th. And we're going to invite people, we're going to send letters out, we're going to make phone calls, and we're going to make announcements for those of us that haven't yet joined the church. Maybe people who've been here for a while and have just never had the invitation. Maybe for different reasons. We have a handful of people that are embarrassed to be up in front by themselves, and so maybe there'll be more. And then we have a handful of new guests and visitors that we would just get a chance to ask them. And so we're going to start talking about that this next Sunday, and we've got a list in the office of people we're going to try and reach out to. It'll also be a way to reconnect with some people and see how they are and if they have any needs. So that's coming up on Palm Sunday. We also have a picture director. And so Sunday, let's see. Sunday we will start talking about it, and the following Sunday we'll have registrations in the Welcome Center. There's also going to be a link on the website so that you can just do that online and get yourself signed up for a professional photography experience where you would get one free something by something. Let's just say a 5x8. I don't know. You know how that works. Yeah, you know how that works. And it's also going to be a chance for us to update some information in the church. And I think you're going to be getting a robocall next week from your pastor. So that'll be exciting. You'll look forward to getting that. Don't hang up on me. Dean does a robocall. So those are things that are coming up in the life of the church. And this is our first night of communion on Wednesday night, starting at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. See, this one starts. And then we go into Bible study. So good to be with you. We're going to have two questions today. The first question is, where did you see God in the last week? So if you'll take a moment to turn to a neighbor, someone around you, and help answer that question. Where did you you see God in the last week? No? How did you see God last week?
I'll be your partner. Yeah. On a tire.
It was cute. It was. Yeah, I got it fixed. It's all taken care of.
You. What are the odds?
Oh my gosh.
You didn't know she was from church? No. I was driving behind her on the way out to the hospital, and her left
was like
tire
wobbling.
was just wobbling all over the place, and I thought, there's probably going to be a bolt of nut coming off of that tire, and I could just see her, and I thought, okay, we had to stop for a stop sign, so I looked my arm and put my window down, and I thought, she looks like she doesn't want to do this, but she said, please have your back tire checked. Was it loose? Was the thing
So
loose or something?
actually, apparently my husband hit a pothole and knocked something into it, and there was actually a groove dug into the rim that had knocked some stuff loose underneath. So I just got all new rims on my tires.
I'm so glad it was you, because even on my way home, as I was coming down the road, I thought, Lord, I hope that lady stopped and got her tire fixed and it was okay. Oh my goodness, that's crazy. And now the odds are, it's really, did you guys get flooded this year? We did. And the next night, it was a little stream, but Alan and I brought it on because we've been flooded so many times. Yeah, almost family in Nebraska. Three cities went down. These bridges that are the interstate.
That's why she does the rest of the elephants in the show.
So far, they're all up there looking at it. It's been what they got. It's going to hit. It's going to hit. It's going to hit. As well as it's flooding blizzards.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. So let's talk a little bit about the Old Testament. Let's talk about Amos. You're going to take some notes, probably. I was going to be gracious and write you out some notes, but I decided not to do that. So there you go. Today, I want to start by saying that Pastor Allen is not an Old Testament scholar. I do not have a degree in Old Testament. I'm not a doctor, but I can read books, and I can listen to videos, and I can make notes, and we can present, and we can all ask questions. I always love doing Bible studies with churches because you're put in this position where people think you know the answer to every question there is, and I don't, and I'm not afraid to say I don't know. So if you want to ask a question and I want to say I don't know, I'll write it down on my notebook that I brought, and if there's an answer that I can go find for us, then I'll find it. And if I just need to say, that's a great question, I have no idea, then I'm not going to try and come up with an answer that sounds smart. I'm just going to say I don't know. Is that okay? All right. I'm not a scholar. I just want to crack open the Bible. I want us to crack the Bible open and see what we can find. I get excited when we see new ways of looking at the Bible, because I think that's our task, is to grow with the Bible and continue to learn a little bit more and a little bit more, which means we may see things differently. We may ask some questions, and sometimes we get answers and sometimes we don't. Today we're going to look at the social world of the Bible, and that's going to be the beginning of this study. Really try and set the context for basically the whole Bible, because it's not the context of 2019, it's not the context of middle-class America, and so we want to put ourselves in that, we want to know more about that context so we can better understand what's going on in the Bible. We'll set up Amos. We'll talk a little bit about Amos, but we won't get too much into it. See, there we go. Let's do that. Next week, we're going to look at Amos 1 and 2. So if you're asking what are we supposed to read and do and get ready for, Amos 1 and 2 will be next week. We're going to look at this question, what is justice? When we talk about justice is important to God, the justice of God all through the prophets. We're not talking about criminal justice. We're not talking about going and getting people that are doing things wrong and punishing them. It's a different kind of thing. And then to look at and see how Israel got to where it was, especially here in the book of Amos. Then we got 3 more weeks. April 3rd, we're going to look at Amos 3 through 6. We're going to look at oracles, which are little mini sermons. I'm working my way through a book that I'm really falling in love with by Peter Enns. So we're going to talk about wisdom and the goal of wisdom in the Bible. April 10th, we're going to look at Amos 7 through 9, which is basically the last 3 chapters. There's 5 visions we're going to look at. And then we're also going to look at Wesley's Sermon 107, which is from Isaiah 5, 1 through 7. And it has to do with grapes and spoiling grapes, and it has to do with gratitude, and it's going to tie into this whole theme of the hole in the gospel and Amos and justice and all this. And then our last week, April 17th, will be Holy Week, and we will have Bible study. We're going to look again at Amos 9 and look at the visions of hope that are in Amos 9, because it's not all God's going to get you. There's some hope in it, and if you've read through Amos, that probably made sense to you, because you just kind of read it and you're like, oh my goodness, okay. We're going to have a conversation about chosenness and what it means to be chosen and what we do with that chosenness. And that has something to say about Amos and American Christianity where it is today. Amos and American Christianity, so we're just going to get terribly political and really, no we're not. It'll be, that's what we're going to look at. And then just some final thoughts. So that's kind of where we're headed. Let's talk about prophetic literature. Prophetic literature is not just future announcements. Sometimes we think all prophecy, prophetic literature is, here's what's going to happen in the future. More specifically, sometimes we read it and we say, what's going to happen in 2019? And I think that's misreading something that may have been written 3,000 years ago. Okay? So how do we go about reading some of this? The work of the prophet had to do with warnings of their sins and their walking away from God's laws at the time. And what were the warnings that these prophets were bringing? Many times proclaiming the words of God, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. But that's the work of the prophetic literature. It's not all looking into the future, okay? Sometimes you hear the word major and minor prophets, and you start to wonder, well, what made them major and what made them minor? It's real simple. The longer books are major and the smaller books are minor, okay? It doesn't mean that the major ones, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, that they're greater or they trump or they're more important. It was just a length thing. And then you have minor prophets like Amos. So you've got Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. This will be on the test tomorrow. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Okay. A lot of the Old Testament is the work of this prophetic literature and prophets coming and speaking for God because the kings didn't quite work out and some of the other ways didn't work out for them. Okay? Who is a prophet? Who is a prophet? One of the books that I'm looking at for this study is called The Prophets by Abraham J. Heschel. He's a Jewish rabbi, author. A lot of his stuff, this is from 1962. But he begins his book, and it'll tell us a little bit about just the work of the prophet. This book is about some of the most disturbing people who have ever lived. The men whose inspiration brought the Bible into being. The men whose image is often our refuge in distress, and whose voice and vision sustain our faith. The significance of Israel's prophets lies not only in what they said, but also in what they were. We cannot fully understand what they meant to say, to us, unless we have some degree of awareness of what happened to them. And I think that gets back to this context that we're going to look at in just a little bit. The moments that passed in their lives are not now available and cannot become the object of scientific analysis. All we have is the consciousness of the moments as preserved in words. Skipping several paragraphs. The prophet is a person, not a microphone. He is endowed with a mission, with the power of a word, not his own, that accounts for his greatness, but also with temperament, concern, character, and individuality, as there is no resisting the impact of divine inspiration. So at times there was no resisting the vortex of his own temperament. The word of God reverberated in the voice of man. And then skipping a couple pages, last little blurb here. The prophet was an individual who said no to his society, condemning its habits and assumptions, its complacency, waywardness, and syncretism. He was often compelled to proclaim the very opposite of what his heart expected. His fundamental objective was to reconcile man and God. Why do the two need reconciliation? Perhaps it's due to man's false sense of sovereignty. Man's false sense of sovereignty. Sprawling pride. Resenting God's involvement in history. All right. Who's the prophet? There's some ideas on that. So let's look at the social world of the Bible. The social world of the Bible, and I am lifting this from a scholar named Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg is more of a progressive scholar, thinker. He passed away in 2015. What I was watching was from 2014, and you could tell he was laboring as he presented it. And it took a while, but he is very good at putting things in context and knowing, here's the word of the Bible, here's what was going on at that time, so that we can better get an idea. So he's going to present four pieces of the social world at that time in the Bible, not just in Amos, but really all throughout the entire Bible, up until almost a few hundred years ago with the Industrial Revolution. Okay, he calls it the ancient or pre-modern domination systems. That's exciting. That's something you can put on a bumper sticker, put on your car. Ancient pre-modern domination systems. That's very important. It's very important to understand the context and the voices, the ears that would have heard these words, so that we can understand what the Bible is about. Because if we don't have this understanding of context, we miss a bunch of the meaning of the Bible. Again, it's not that the Bible was written specifically so we would read it in 2019. It has Holy Spirit guidance and inspiration that gets us here. But I think it's unfair to read most of Scripture and say, well, this is written for me. Well, it wasn't. It was written for another time, and another place, and another people. And if we don't understand that, we miss some things. So here's four things that the Bible isn't lifting up as good, really, but really that the Bible is protesting against. This is what they're working against. Ancient, pre-modern domination systems. Exciting. All right. Number one, the ancient pre-modern domination systems were politically oppressive. Politically oppressive. That at that time, you would talk a lot about elites and peasants. And your elites were going to be your monarchies and your families of that 90 to 95% of the people at that time had absolutely no voice or no say in anything that happened whatsoever. So that's most everything. Politically oppressive, not, everybody gets a vote and there's some corruption here and there kind of thing going on, but you don't have any say whatsoever at all. So it's politically oppressive. Okay. Number 2 is that it was economically exploitative. Economically oppressive. That the top 2% of the people owned a half to 2/3 of all production of all wealth. So I know nowadays we talk a lot about the 1%, blah, 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 economic disparity, and I believe in some of that, most of that. But it was much different then. You had 2% of the people owned almost all of the production of wealth. And what was the production of wealth going to be back then? Farms, yeah, agriculture. It's going to be agriculture. It's going to be land. Facebook, eBay, no. Yeah, agriculture. So you are the monarchy, you're the king of the area. You're going to get your wealth from the agriculture through taxation, through ownership of the agricultural land, through tenant farmers, through day laborers, through all the different ways that you're going to be able to squeeze money out of your peasants. Right? So politically oppressive, economically exploitative. Number 3, and I've been thinking more about number 3 more today, because I think this is a piece that we miss in our reading of the Bible. And number 3 is chronically violent. This was a time and a whole season of the world that was chronically violent. So this happens several ways. If you're the monarch, you're going to use violence to crush the peasants when you need to crush the peasants. Don't let them get too thoughtful in their ways. But you're always going to war. So warfare is huge. And what warfare was this group of elites fighting this group of elites. These kings fighting these kings. These groups, this kingdom fighting this kingdom. Of course, the peasants were the ones doing the fighting. And if you were the monarch of an area, and you had squeezed your peasants for all they're worth, you need more peasants to squeeze all of their worth. So you're going to go to war, and you're going to take over this land, and you're going to be more prosperous. And so this time of chronic violence, and I think about today. I have never lived a day in my life where I thought war was going to end my life in Arlington, Texas, or College Station, or here in Killeen, or anything like that. And so how does that drastically change my worldview, drastically change how I would read the Bible, when in times there's literal war your entire life? Okay, so chronic violence, we know that's true in some areas of our world today, but mostly for us especially, not so much. And then the last one, number 4, is ordained by religion. That all of this, this rule is ruled by religion. And so you have people who are ruling by divine right. Okay, the kings, the monarchs, some of them call themselves sons of God. Okay, we know about Caesar and some of those people that they used some of the same language that we use for Jesus, that they believe they're a son of God, born of a virgin, different things like that. So the kings were put in that place because God put them there. And so it's not me being a mean king and oppressing you, but it's God who set this up. And so let's not say no against God, right? Okay. So there's 4: politically oppressive, economically exploitative, chronically violent, and ordained by religion. Now, I want us to spend a few moments thinking about that context versus our own context here in Killeen in 2019. Middle class, upper middle class. We have TVs that we don't know where to throw them away because we have so many of them. I'm thinking about the church right now, actually. We have storage units where we put things we don't know where to put. We have pop-up trailers in our driveway that we're concerned if the hot water heater were to break when it gets too cold outside, and that's our concern for the day. We have savings accounts, pensions. And so think for me about some Bible studies, Bible stories. Now, they don't have to be in Amos, they can be anywhere in the Bible. Think through a story or two. And I want you to think about how you might read that differently in light of these contexts. Does that make sense? Okay, so just think of a few stories. Maybe your favorite story in the Bible, or a lesson in the Bible, or a teaching in the Bible, and think, okay, this is what it means to me now in my modern time, and it's valuable, and I hold it close to my heart. What would that mean to the time that heard that, that's being oppressed and economically exploited and chronically violent, and that God has ordained everything that's happening to you? And somehow in the midst of that worldview, these scriptures pour out, and somehow, maybe God. Okay? So that's my question. So think on that for me, okay? So discuss as you think of a name or a story. Share with each other, and then in a minute, I'm going to ask you if anyone came up on something that just really makes you pop and made your hair stand up, okay? Rephrase the question. I thought it was perfectly presented, Rebecca.
I'm confused.
Think of some Bible stories, or a story,
not a parable, though.
maybe even a parable, because that's a lesson of the Word, lesson of the Bible. Think of a lesson of the Bible, and then think to yourself, how might I think of this differently? Or would it have more deeper meaning? Would it have different meaning put in this context of the ancient pre-modern domination systems versus where we are today in middle-class America? That's a hard one. Okay? You're taking this pass-fail. You're going to be okay. So just think for a moment about what a story might be, and then in a minute. Oh, no, I don't have an example for you. I did. I talked about the chronic violence. Okay. Yeah.
We're supposed to share it.
Yeah.
Jeremiah talks about violence all. God's going to sweep you from the north, wipe you out.
Right.
I had an example pop in my head if it would help.
Sure.
Okay, so I was thinking about, you have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Oh.
So to me, that
Yeah.
means my suburban friend gossips about me,
Yes.
and I need to find a way to show love and not return that hateful behavior. But that's so different if it's
The
this
Assyrians.
soldier's threatening me with my life, and I'm afraid I may not survive today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what I'm thinking about. So the scriptures that say love your enemy, pray for them. In our 2019, we might think of another country, but sometimes we think of our neighbor that kicked our dog last week.
Yeah.
And we say, God wants me to love them. Well, in this context that we set up, it might be that king that has taken your family's land away. It might be the Assyrians that are going to come through. And so what is it? In that context, what is some of that? Does it change our understanding of it? Make it harder? Does it make it easier?
Pastor, we've been fighting that since 9/11.
Awesome, one more time.
We've been fighting this stuff since 9/11, since the tower. You know,
Yeah.
religion, it's become a religious war, you know, and it's, you know, I have friends that are Muslim, and they're nice people, and they're good people, and they're not like, they don't believe that way. But, you know, you throw everybody into one group, you know, and they're all that way, you know, and that, you know, that's not true.
Yeah.
We have Christians that are pretty bad too, you know, and you know, so it's, you can't say all Christians are bad just because that guy's bad, you know. And, just you
Yeah.
have to look at what it is, but now it's the war. I don't know if it's ever going to end, you know. And it's hate on both sides.
Yeah.
Because you kill me, and I got to go kill you, and, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so maybe there's a way to look at it too, is that there are areas in the world and there are conflicts in the world that are still true to this. And so the way some of the scripture reads to them is going to be different than how we read it when we're not living in the midst of that.
Blessed
Sal?
are.
Pastor Allen, I heard the Lord speak to me one day. You know how you get angry? Someone says something to you,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really hurting you or something that's not true, and yet they're pointing the finger at you
Mm-hmm.
and saying, well, you did this, you said that.
Yeah. I got an email this today.
What the Lord spoke to me
Mhm.
was, when you get upset, when you get angry, who do you hurt? That's the way he spoke to me. He didn't say, who do you hurt?
Mhm.
He said, who do you hurt? You hurt yourself.
Mhm.
And when I heard that, that was truly a message from the Lord. Because showing anger back or getting upset, it makes them the winner. And what
Yeah.
happened was, when he said, share the love, the peace that I give to you. And that was such a beautiful answer. Because when I start showing, you know, well, I don't always say everything that isn't hurtful or harmful to you. I do too.
If we can take hate off of our hearts and put it somewhere else, then it frees us up.
Yes.
And I think that's what, absolutely that's what God would want for us. Amanda may have wanted to say something here.
Blessed are the poor.
Oh!
When
Blessed
you
are the
think
poor.
about that, especially in maybe even our community, we might think of
Yeah.
people we know,
Okay.
maybe even sometimes ourselves. And then you think about what the poor meant then, and you think about the beggar sitting outside
Mm-hmm.
for the drink of water,
Mm-hmm.
the lack of utter power, the lack of freedom.
Yeah.
I don't want to go to the political side of this comment.
Keith's gonna go political, everyone listen up.
Today's television is
Yeah.
too hard to understand if we have some inkling of the story of the bondage in Egypt and the kingdom rule in that area at the time. Trump wants to be a king.
Okay.
He doesn't want to follow the rule of our land. And
All right.
follow the laws set forth by our Congress, what have you. So he wants to do everything he can to build a monument on the border.
So, yeah, Keith, you got political.
Yeah.
Goodness gracious. Can't believe you did that. Yeah, so when any ruler in the world starts to live in this, it feels yucky. And we haven't lived that way for 300 years. And so if that's in Venezuela, or I didn't hear what you said at the beginning, so I didn't hear. No, I'm being facetious. I didn't hear what you said at the beginning, but yeah, I hear you.
But I was thinking about what you said,
Yeah.
about that you have not lived in a time where you felt threatened.
Right.
And there are those of us who are old enough
Yeah.
to remember when we had the drills in school, where
Yeah.
we had to get underneath our desks because of the Cold War, and we had to practice that, constantly.
Yeah.
But you're so
and what's weird is that I'm so privileged because now the kids have to do the active shooter drills.
Active shooter.
And I didn't have to do any of that anywhere in between. So I was born well after Cuba, and anyway. Okay. Well, so y'all are gonna go to sleep, and then you're gonna wake up and go, oh, that question Alan asked, I've got the perfect answer for it. And that's okay. And if you don't, that's okay too. Let's move on. Lesson being that when we're learning about the Bible, we need to be able to go back and get the context of what's going on there. What is it that they're saying to those people? There's so much value in knowing that the Holy Spirit still speaks to us through Scripture, and we absolutely believe that. But we're missing about half of the understanding if we don't understand some of these things as we're looking through it. And as we get into Amos, it's true for Amos, because Amos is going to be about power crushing down on these 95% and God's response to that. So, Andy.
I was thinking about the visual part of the plumb line
Mm-hmm.
in Amos, because it wasn't trying to decide among different options which one is most preferable to us. Rather, it's a plumb line that God has set.
Yeah.
And what's important is what pleases God rather than what pleases us.
That was great, Andy. So one of the visions that we'll look at in a few weeks is the vision of the plumb line. And Andy is saying what's ultimately important is the rule and the design and the direction of God. And I think too often we probably get in our fights and bickers and all that, and we're not even in the world of where that plumb line is. We're over here, over there. Very good, very good. All right. A few more thoughts here, friends.
Just a comment.
Sure.
If I hear investigation one more time, when
Okay.
I turn the TV on, for the last 2.5 years, we have investigations.
Yes.
And that's all we hear of. And it's a little, it's gossip at a high level. And I'm tired of it. You know, let's get to being a country that believes in people because they're good people. And there's a lot of good things going on in Washington, but the news media is just, it's another investigation, and we're going to do it again. And oh, this guy was lying. But then all of a sudden, we want to get him in front of the Senate committee and the House committee and all that.
Won't it be a beautiful day if there becomes a tipping point where the whole country says, we've had enough of that.
Enough.
Let's go back to working together. Let's go back to being a country together. Let's go back to being one of the greatest nations in the world, and not think that the enemy is across the street from us. Yeah.
Okay. Satan being alive and well, stirring things up. That's what he does. I mean, I truly believe that. That's what he does. Just causes conflict.
Lots of that.
It's always existed, and it exists here too.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we can look back and see that nothing new is under the sun.
Yeah. Conflict. All right. So this social world of the Bible that we're talking about, you can see how it was true basically throughout the whole Bible. That Egypt and Exodus, Pharaoh, Egypt time, the monarchies in Israel, which is where we find Amos, Babylon, the Roman Empire, with Jesus and Paul and all of that. One more word on peasant life. Peasant life and the life expectancy. Just a story about their life. If you survived the first 5 years, okay, back in the day, not everyone did, right? If you survived the first 5 years and you were in the elite class, your life expectancy was 60 to 70 years. And in this peasant class, if you lived the first 5 years, your life expectancy was 30. So it was half of what the other was. So that's just a little sliver of a story of how it was really two different worlds of living, two different worlds of life. So the Bible's concerned in many ways, and things that we don't really focus on a lot in our own modern study of the Bible, is this system. It's this overpowering system and the powers. And as Jesus comes in and introduces a new way of living and a new way of loving, it was speaking to Rome, and it was speaking to this system that we've been talking about, and seeing God as the owner of everything, and God as the owner and one who loved and cared for everyone, and had God's hands in everything, even the economy that we look at here. So very quickly about Amos. Amos. I'm going to read Amos 6:12. Here we go. This is maybe, there's a lot of scriptures you could pick that just kind of say, hey, here's kind of the general story of Amos, but I like this one. It's kind of poetic. Amos 6:12. Do horses run on rocks? Does one plow the sea with oxen? But you have turned justice into poison, and the fruit of righteousness into bitterness. And that's the lead on this book of Amos, is God looking at God's people and saying, you've taken righteousness and you've taken justice, and it's like you're trying to get the horses to run on the rocks, and you're trying to plow the ocean, and that's where that comes from. So we'll be getting into that. Amos was one of our earliest classical prophets. So when we start talking about Isaiah and Hosea, Amos was one of the first, probably around 750 BC. I like that song. That's our rule. If it comes up, you have to stand up and dance and sing. So a little bit of timeline context for us. Okay, Egypt and Pharaoh and let my people go is going to be around 1200 BCE. Okay, 1200 BC. We're going to move into the first monarchies of Israel: Saul, David, Solomon, around 1000. Okay, 1200, 1000. That puts Amos around 750. And so what we'll talk about a little bit next week is how Israel freed themselves. We're free from the king. We're free from Pharaoh and that domination system. And we're going to come out here and we're going to set up shop and we're going to need a king. And that king's going to lead to having another monarchy. And suddenly we've got another Pharaoh inside us, because then Israel becomes the domination system and how that works. And maybe that has something to do with humanity. I don't know. Amos was from Tekoa, and that's just 10 miles south of Jerusalem from Judah. So remember that they broke up into two. And you had Judah on the south with Jerusalem, and you had Israel in the north. And so Amos is going to come from the south to the north and speak to the king Jeroboam and the kings in the north. And there's going to come a time as you read through Amos where the prophet Amos don't have the name written down. Anyway, he basically says, hey, why don't you go back to the south and say your things down there. Leave us alone. All right? Oh, that was the king, Uzziah. The prophet was Amaco. Dean had it memorized. I thought you know. Okay. All right. Okay.
Amaziah.
Amaziah. That's it. Thank you, Lisa. Amaziah for the win. Amos didn't write the book, as a lot of prophets. They didn't sit down and write out a book. But what they would do is they would go out and give these oracles. They'd go out and give these short, brief, powerful, poetic, memorable sermons and exhortations. And then someone would write them down. That's why you're going to see a lot of memorable language. You're going to see a lot of big poetry, a lot of big words, and you cows of Bashan. Oh, you don't get to say that anymore. And so that's part of that, part of just the work of the prophets. And he was a shepherd. And as I was reading through this last week, I'm reminded what we thought of shepherds back then, right? Shepherds are lowly. Shepherds are out in the field. Shepherds are unclean. Shepherds are not allowed to go to worship because they're unclean and they're not clean to go into synagogue. And so here's again another shepherd being used. David was a shepherd. Okay. And then finally to say that this was a great time of prosperity for Israel. So we kind of set it up with that domination system. But Israel had lots of good wars and lots of good fights, and then finally the wars died down, and they were in a place where they could prosper a little bit and gain some wealth. And so that's where, as we read through this, there's a lot of opulence, and where God's going to start saying, you know what? I don't like your worship. I don't like your women laying around asking their men to bring them wine, taking advantage of the poor. That's where that comes from. So one more thing I want to read to us, and then we'll open it up for questions and things to look for next week. Again, from Abraham Heschel. When Amos appeared in the north, there was pride, plenty, and splendor in the land, elegance in the cities, and might in the palaces. The rich had their summer and winter palaces adorned with costly ivory, gorgeous couches with damask pillows, on which they reclined at their sumptuous feasts. They planted pleasant vineyards, anointed themselves with precious oils. Their women, compared by Amos to the fat cows of Bashan, were addicted to wine. At the same time, there was no justice in the land. The poor were afflicted, exploited, even sold into slavery, and the judges were corrupt. In the midst of this atmosphere arose Amos, a shepherd. So maybe that's our setup for us as we dig in and read it again. It takes about half an hour to read through Amos, so maybe you can get through that. What thoughts or questions or anything do you have at this point as we just kind of tiptoed into it just a little bit? Keith?
First chapter in Amos talks about an earthquake.
Yes.
Were prophets necessarily in tune to weather capabilities, or was it a directive from God saying, I'm going to crack open the earth?
Keith is asking if prophets had a connection to weather, kind of like you'd think of the stories of Noah with God flooding. So could prophets? That's a good question. I do know that I read, and it's too far back in my head, I read that they believe there was an earthquake, and so they've got a date for that. I don't know the significance of that, but apparently it's just a time marker for them.
760 BC.
760, Rebecca's Bible says. So somewhere around 750, then there was an earthquake. I don't know if that ties into anything else other than just a timestamp and saying, lo, about the time when there was that earthquake, Amos showed up. He called him Amos Moses. You know that song?
So it's an afterthought rather than a forethought.
Yes. Sure. Okay. Andy.
One of the things which I recall in studying the Old Testament was that they tried to be a spokesperson. The Hebrew word, or nabi, is a word saying that he speaks for God. And I think this is important to the prophets generally, but especially Amos, that he saw his role as being a spokesperson for God.
Yeah, the role of the prophet as, well, yeah, and we kind of started the first reading by saying sometimes what they said really didn't align with their heart. And how much courage it took to stand in front of kings and say, hey, your way's not cutting it for God. That's a huge amount of courage to be a spokesperson.
Why did you choose Amos to begin with?
Amos is just one of those books that's known for this justice piece. And we're digging into it with Hole in the Gospel a little bit. This is where we're going to get in Amos 5, we're going to get that righteousness rolls down like a stream, a line that Martin Luther King's going to use later. So, not for a big, large, grand reason other than that. I've always wanted to do a Bible study on Amos. The Old Testament's harder. This is harder stuff. This isn't looking through Matthew and saying, isn't this a touching story about Jesus and the widow? This is hard stuff. And my hope is that it can invite us to consider how we see our own faith and how we see our religion, how we see it tie into our current culture. And I think that's something that we can all do. All right, we're good and past my 7 o'clock. That's good. Mark's going to ask about the Hebrew language.
Oh, no, not this time. No, I was just drawn to the thought, and this is something that I think would be interesting to develop, but with the prophets that I know of, or the prophets I think of, oftentimes they came from a humbler means, or what we would call humbler. You know, you think of, you know, even Moses, who was raised a certain way and then ended up turning away from, you know, Egypt. He lived for many, many years, you know, working, you know, pastoral work, in the sense that, you know, he was literally out in the fields working with cattle or sheep or whatever it was he was you know, herding. But what was interesting is it seems like, you know, when I start thinking of prophets who kind of stick to me in my mind, you know, David, same background. You look at Jesus, who had a background in carpentry. You know, you look at kind of this idea of coming from humble beginnings, of not necessarily associated with the aristocracy in the sense that you're looking at like the richest, mightiest people. These are people from humble starts that, you know, if you think back to kind of your initial question of what's the world like, you know, back then, for someone from such a humble beginning to come about to have, you know, this message to the greater, you know, world, it's astounding to think that someone that was a, you know, a little person, nobody, could come out and consistently again and again and again, and not just with one prophet, but it seems like with nearly every one.
I love that piece, and I think, you know, today we look for perfection in people. You know, even if we want to get political again, we're looking for candidates that do not have a mark on their record. We're looking for candidates that didn't write whatever they wrote in their college essay, that didn't say these certain things years ago on a recording. We're looking for, you know, perfect, and if we go further, we're looking for Ivy League, and they're usually this and they're that, and that for us in many ways is a leader and someone that we're going to support. But in the Bible, again and again and again and again, it's broken backwards. It's Saul who went after Christians and then turns to become the strongest supporter. It's David who sinned mightily and killing Bathsheba's husband.
The last shall be first.
So maybe there again is that setup of our current culture versus the culture of the Bible. What do we look for in leaders and perfection and they can't mess up and versus the model that God showed us. And then the other thing I was thinking, Mark, is if this setup is accurate about the 4 things that we shared about the cultural context, you would need that person to have lived in that cultural context to know that oppression. It would be very hard for them to come from that 2% with that voice, I guess. So.
But if you look through the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, God didn't always pick perfect characters. He picked flawed characters.
Again and again.
And he knew that they were flawed, and he just continued to use them. I saw a movie one time called Machine Gun Preacher, which is about a true story of a man who was really bad. And he had a religious conversion. He wound up going to Africa, setting up orphanages for those children that were being taken by warlords and stuff like that, you know. And if you haven't seen the movie, you got to see the movie.
Machine Gun Preacher?
Machine Gun Preacher. And he has a line in there, and he said, so why are you getting guns to come fight with these people? He goes, sometimes God needs a lion, and sometimes God needs a lamb. So he was going to go after those warlords with his guns and go get those kids back. And he did. And they showed at the end of the movie, they showed the real guy. He was a big old dude. He was a biker. He'd been a biker. He'd been in prison, and he comes out. If you stand the first 15 minutes of the movie, it's really good. I mean, first 15 minutes, I almost wanted to turn it off. Gerard Butler is playing the guy.
I bet I could pass the offering plate a few more times if I had a machine gun.
But it was just the way he was in the beginning and how he changed when his wife took him to church and he saw missionary going on in Africa. And he said God came to him in a dream and told him he needed to go to Africa.
So that's going to be part of Amos. Is at the end of Amos, after saying, Israel, I got you out of Egypt. I gave you these new laws. I set you up this land, and you have treated the poor like this, and you have taken advantage of my justice, and you're bad, 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 and I'm going to throw fire on you, and yet I'm ready to save you, and continue to use you as the people of Israel, and that's the very end. So when we're ready to give up on people, we have a Bible with a God that seems to find ways to continue and to love. And then somewhere in here, I would like to talk about Jonah. And Jonah sent to Nineveh to have Nineveh turn and bless God. Even their cows turned and blessed God. And this is their ultimate enemy, the Assyrians. Absolute worst enemy you can possibly think of. God says, I need you to go tell them that I am their God. And they turn and worship. So.
Yes, we need all. Just imagine for a moment if we didn't have someone who could just sweep up the carpet. If there was no one there. If we had someone who didn't understand us and just kind of put us away. You know what? One day I walked into the grocery store and there was a soldier standing there, and I said, thank you for serving our country. I appreciate the freedom. And I said, what do you do? He said, oh man, I don't want to share it. I just do it. I said, sir, we need you. And he jumped up and he looked and he said, what, man? I said, we need all of you. What if we didn't have you? Who would be doing that? And you know what? A lot of times we do not understand that we need all of you, not just one or two. What if we just had upper people and no one below us?
God loves everybody.
He does. Isn't that beautiful?
And that's kind of part of the story of Amos.
Yes.
Friends, thank you for your time this evening. I hope to see you next week. We've got 5 weeks. We're going to do some Amos, and you're welcome here. No matter where you are politically, too. Boy, you guys, I tell you what, I can't even hear. My ears are clogged up. I can't hear half the things y'all say. But Looking forward to it. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week. 6 o'clock, we'll start communion service. And Sunday, we'll continue with the second section of the Hole in Our Gospel book. And that's where the message will come from. So we're kind of doing a handful of things right now. We're looking at this. We're looking at Hole in the Gospel. And all you got to do for this study is show up. If you want to read Amos 1 and 2 next week, you can.
I have a year to
And we'll have some, you'll have to share with me the 12 minor prophets before we have communion. All right, let's pray. God, thank you for your word. We thank you for the truth that it is for us today, as it was thousands of years ago. And we would pray to have the courage to investigate and to crack open and to look at ourselves. Not to worry about what's going on in the government, not to worry about what might other people be thinking, but in our own heart and in our own community in this church, what might these words be calling us to do today? In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thanks, gang. Good to be with you.
Still reading? As long as I had it back on wall.
Oh.
I have a minor in my house if you need any help.
Oh, yeah. Sounds like it's getting more and more difficult.
With your insights. Thank you. I love your smile. Oh, thank you. We need to see cheerfulness. Thank you. Especially in this country today, right? Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Hey, you're Tracy, right? Did you hear you're my running buddy?
Oh, yeah, but yeah, you told me.
It's amazing.
One of those, all right.
It's great. It rains some. There's one night, in fact, the PAX system where they built it, and then it rained all night, and Alan said he kept having bad dreams that we were going to let the inside with PAX system. But during the day, it was just beautiful. Verdant, frogs everywhere. Walk down.
There's a book. Another one is Tracy.
Was always her name? Oh, okay.
Just amazing.
Yeah.
It's only been, it's too cold last week to take.
They had to leave.
Yeah. Transformation. Be gardening?
Of course.
Good.
My hands hurt from weeding.
Yeah.
Not gardening yet, just weeding.
Yeah.
So, and he goes to have that, and he got.
If I go find my kittens, they're somewhere out there.
Somewhere.
Yeah. See you later.
So that's why it's called faith. And you go to what? Plant potatoes, because don't you know we're in the middle of a 2 or 3 year drought? And then you go, I don't know, I'm just doing it. You know, so he goes there and he plants potatoes and turns no rain. But he was another guy. And the other one is called faith like potato. But the other one, that guy was another one who was bad. You know, he cursed all the time, drank all the time, and he said when God came to him, he stopped cursing, he stopped drinking. He set up community, like houses for women that had been like abandoned and had kids, and it was then the AIDS that was he was taking those people in, and every time it's almost like Nehemiah. Every time he prays, he would happen, you know, and it was just like. And he did this, he would show up. When he did, he would show up. I mean, excellent. You know, and I just got finished reading Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. You've not read that book. It's powerful. And he's a Muslim. He's a Muslim. It was a doctor. He's deceased now. He died of stomach cancer. But he had a friend that was a Christian, and he was trying to talk, and he was trying to persuade the Islam, and the other guy was, but they were on a debate team together, so they knew, and they would go back and forth, and he wound up realizing that Islam was false and Christianity was real. But it was just a powerful book, you know what I mean?